Being Swiss, of course, I have a watch, yes, so I try to make sure that I do not spend too much of your time because the weather is so beautiful outside. I really appreciate that you make the effort to come, yes, to listen to some reflections on humanitarian action, past, present, and maybe also a bit its future. Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, also dear friends, it is of course a dangerous habit to play with instruments of other professions that one does not know much about. I'm not a historian. You will tell me whether my juggling around with a historian's, I understand, favorite line, William Faulkner's quote, "The past is never dead, it's not even past," is convincing or not. I must confess that I have not read Faulkner's Requiem for a Nun, where this quote appears. However, I devoured and I enjoyed Eric Hobsbawm's The Age of Extremes, a must-read back in the 1990s when I was an undergraduate studying political science in Lausanne, in Switzerland. And it is, of course, from this book I got the inspiration for the term an age of reorder. Back in the 1990s, we had just come out of the age of the Cold War. Some even talked about the end of history. Would you not agree that it feels as it was just yesterday? The present is rarely present. It's already past. At least that is my view. That of someone who realizes that change is the one fixed point in a changing age. Here I paraphrase Sherlock Holmes, who called his trusted companion Dr. John H. Watson, I quote, "the one fixed point in a changing world." Enough of quote, gymnastics. I need to get the right paper. Let me first thank Andrew Thompson for his kind invitation to deliver this lecture. I feel more than just a bit overwhelmed, of course an euphemism for being a little bit nervous. I did not hesitate to accept this invitation to come to Exeter. Andrew, as you have seen, knows that I'm not only a humanitarian, but also a Sherlockian, a Sherlock Holmes devotee, if you like. Whereas Exeter is new territory for me, nearby Dartmoor, of course, is not. Rest assured. Tonight I'm not talking about the footprints of a giant hound, such as the Hound of the Baskervilles, who haunted the noble family of the Baskervilles on nearby Dartmoor. I'm going to talk about my not giant, rather modest footprint in my métier, that of a humanitarian. Job sounds a little bit too casual, profession really too technical. Métier, I think, is just right. Now, what do I want to talk about tonight for the next 30 or 40 minutes or so? Mainly two things, and they are, of course, closely interwoven. Firstly, I would like to highlight some of the things that I think have changed in my métier over the past 2 fast-moving decades. I will list some points that I think are important. There are others that I will miss out. My list is, of course, incomplete. Secondly, as I present these reflections, I hope that those who are historians amongst you will feel inspired and we could actually have conversations between historians and of humanitarian action and people like me, humanitarian practitioners. Because I'm convinced that historians like you can help humanitarian practitioners like me to navigate better through today's age of reorder. Looking at the shifting landscape of global football is one way to understand what I mean by age of reorder. Former world champions return home before the end of the first round, outsiders beat insiders. We experience today a situation in which the international rules-based system founded on principles laid out by US President Woodrow Wilson 100 years ago now is not only challenged by other competing orders, it is also challenged by the leader of the very nation who gave birth to it a century ago. You know who I'm talking about. As the Western humanitarian endeavor is, of course, a side product of this Wilsonian order, we obviously observe a reorder in the humanitarian configuration, as I like to call the humanitarian system as well. In these times of transformation, Your profound knowledge as researchers of humanitarian action in the past enlightens humanitarians like me who act in the present to help the world to be better prepared for the future of tomorrow. Now let me get started. The Polish journalist, correspondent and author Ryszard Kapuscinski, who traveled to many trouble spots, once called the world a violent paradise. This is the world humanitarians navigate, a world where violence is conquered by hope, only to be threatened again by violence, where humanity brutally falls back into the abyss of inhumanity. When humanitarians reflect on their experiences, they like to recall their mileage, especially aging ones like me. I started off as a practitioner 20 years ago in one of Kapuscinski's violent paradises, doing my humanitarian apprenticeship in a place where generations before me had done theirs and where today's generation is repeating that process right now in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. I then moved on and became what I call an entrepreneur of humanitarian action. I have learned that in such context, an enterprising spirit helps you to lead humanitarian operations through dense forest, plain these deserts, over steep mountains, or through half-destroyed towns, through places full of sharks, predators, and untrustworthy characters. Some of them wear traditional dresses, others shiny uniforms, and some smart business suits. Addressing affected people requires shaking hands with these entrepreneurs of violence. We often call them actors of influence. For the past 3 years, I have now been rubbing shoulders with what some would call also predators, the city sharks in the heart of the City of London, where the ICRC runs indeed its UK country office. Senior Humanitarian Affairs and Policy Advisor for the ICRC mission in the UK and Ireland is written on my business card. This is a lengthy description for what is in fact a lobbyist of humanitarian causes. Rest assured, I will not bore you with my mortgage view on humanitarian action. I think you will agree that the view from my other offices, for example this one here from Bukavu in Eastern Congo, is much more exotic. So let me start to take you first to Africa. The first point I suggest we would discuss, or could discuss, is the changing modus operandi of protection work. The place I want to take you first is Al-Malam, at the southern foot of the mountain massif Jebel Mara, here in the middle, in the heart of Darfur, Western Sudan. 15 years ago, Darfur was today's Syria. Hundreds of thousands of displaced civilians fled clashes between insurgents and the central government of Khartoum, supported by nomadic Arab militiamen. The landscape was scattered with burned villages and new IDP camps. I arrived in 2005. I was a humanitarian entrepreneur in charge of a fleet of about 50 trucks, a couple of planes, a few offices, dozens of expatriates, hundreds of local staff. In brief, this was a casebook example of the Western humanitarian industrial enterprise. I call it the Western humanitarian industrial complex, deploying to a major war zone, as we had it seen in the past. The framework set out by the 14th century Arab philosopher Ibn Khaldun to how society transformed from nomadic desert life to settled city life through cycles of conflicts between austere tribal nomads and wealthy, more urban populations remains pertinent to understanding the underlying causes of the conflict that erupted in Darfur in 2003. Establishing a network with nomad leaders became one of my priorities, and this for two reasons. First of all, to negotiate what the ICRC President Peter Mauro pointedly refers to as a license to operate, gaining security guarantees to enable access to areas where one wants to operate. Principles like neutrality, to stay out of controversies in order to stay in a context, are not a panacea, they are useful tools of the humanitarian trade. Secondly, the very leaders who grant this license to operate are often parties to the conflict. They are responsible for compliance with the basic rules of war, the international humanitarian law. Those rules and regulations are enshrined in customary traditions of warfare, as well as the legal frameworks like the Geneva Conventions, of course. A complex and tricky situation that I usually sum up a little metaphorically as follows. Imagine the humanitarian is a non-smoker, the combatant is a smoker. The smoker tolerates the non-smoker taking a seat in the smoking compartment. This is the smoking compartment. The non-smoker engages the smoker in a discussion about smoking habits. He can only hope that the smoker reduces his habits and is considerate to others, in particular to non-smokers. But in essence, the smoker is allowed to smoke in a smoking compartment. The goal of the non-smoker is the reduction of smoking to proportionate quantity for the sake of a better health of the smoker and those around him. This, in a nutshell, although it's a bit lengthy, I realize now, is the work of a protection delegate of the ICRC in times of armed conflict. In Darfur, back in 2005, it was relatively easy to have these non-smoker conversations in the smoking compartment. I'll give you an example. Juma Dagalo, a tribal and militia leader of dubious reputation, a typical oscillator between escalation and de-escalation. After notifying other parties to the conflict, I headed with a team of nurses, water and sanitation engineers, drivers, interpreters to Al-Malam at the southern foot of the Jebel Mara, where we met Juma Dagalo, a mini expedition, if you like. We did not only fix wells and assess the humanitarian situation. Juma Dagalo and I went for a 3-hour walk, just the two of us, with an interpreter armed with a VHF radio and a mobile satellite phone. We discussed access to the area he controlled. I introduced him to the protection mandate. I had one of those smoker-non-smoker conversations. Quite a number of such conversations followed, sometimes in Al-Malam, sometimes in my office. Some were successful, some were not. Things have changed. The smoking compartment still exists. Look at today's stubborn reality of war and violence. But it is challenging for non-smokers to have exchanges with smokers, especially right inside that smoking compartment, where this dialogue is most needed. I experienced this change when I found myself in southern Afghanistan 4 years later in 2009, once again as a humanitarian entrepreneur. Kandahar has become for me the synonym of humanitarian actions behind walls. Not an exception anymore, not yet the rule, but more and more common nonetheless. To ignore this would be naive. I refer to us expatriates living as exotic birds in a cage in our compound that looked a bit like a shabby little chic boutique hotel of exhausted Afghan villas. I hope you can see it there. It was impossible to leave the city. Our soft-skin vehicles would not survive a small IED. Relevant commanders of the decentralized Taliban could not be met in person to obtain security guarantees beyond the perimeter of the city. This does not mean that we abandoned the vital protection dialogue. No, we introduced the Kandahar Model. Years of work in southern Afghanistan, in particular in hospitals, meant that the ICRC was largely tolerated by the population. The provision of video conference calls to hundreds of Afghans so they could actually talk with their family members who were detained by other members of the conflict actually led to a steady stream of visitors into our office. Civilians would inform us about the problems they encountered, night raids, harassment at checkpoints, getting caught up in crossfires, etc., etc. Many protection cases were raised with the parties to the conflict at NATO bases, with Afghan security forces, also with the Taliban, usually indirectly through fixers. Today, the Darfur model, those expeditions in the field, is rarely introduced to places where the Western industrial humanitarian complex freshly deploys. The more restricted Kandahar model is often applied. Smoker-non-smoker conversations in smoking compartments have not become extinct, but they are endangered species. There are at least two reasons to explain this. Firstly, insecurity hampers access to civilians and parties to the conflict. Secondly, the identification of perpetrators is difficult as parties to the conflict operate with proxies and they themselves are increasingly decentralized. You don't really know who is responsible for acts of non-compliance of IHL. In other words, humanitarians have a hard time to sustain a meaningful footprint where the rules of war are disrespected. I call places with this lack of a footprint blind spots. The danger is that an increasing number of blind spots turn into entire blind areas. Are there solutions to counter this? I want to address this now in the second point, or second part of my lecture, and I give it the title, Humanitarian Eyes in the Sky. In 2000, I organized, 18 years ago, my God, in 2000, I organized the first ever ICRC assessment survey of the northern part of the Congolese province of Katanga. This was an expedition into uncharted territory, quite literally. 3 sources of information helped me to decide where to assess the humanitarian needs. First of all, talking to people, Congolese Red Cross volunteers, merchants, returning truck drivers, call it local intelligence. Secondly, the radio transmitter stations of the Catholic missionary networks that were the only communication line managed by civilians along the front line. And last but certainly not least, the map of the province of Katanga from 1953 I guarded like the pupil of my eye. It was the most accurate map at that time. Things changed. In the mid-2000s, the Nokia phone and text messaging became the support instruments, enabling humanitarian entrepreneurs to manage operations on the ground. In the mid-2000s, war-torn central Iraq became, for many humanitarians, myself included, the first experience of a place where we had to work remotely, removed physically hundreds of miles from the location of operations. Only local colleagues could operate in the hotspots. Text messages were now transferred into lifelines for communicating with local colleagues. We tried out the first generations of Google Maps. Today, Nokia text messages are past. Google Earth has replaced the Google Map. Remote sensing by satellite and drones now enters the toolbox of humanitarians. What has become an instrument for archaeologists and geographers has also entered the humanitarian métier. Darfur is a case in point. Back in 2005, it was accessible environment for humanitarians. Today, Darfur and other parts of Sudan have become blind spaces for the Western industrial humanitarian enterprise. Humanitarian eyes in the sky help to overcome this blindness, at least partly. This slide here is about the geospatial autonomy of the conflict between Sudanese armed forces, the Sudanese People Liberation Army, the Sudanese and the Sudan People Liberation Army North from 2010 to 2012 in the border region between North and South Sudan, carried out by the Boston-based Signal Program on Human Security and Technology. It provides a novel way to document abuses through these eyes in the sky. Their 170-page report, packed with as many satellite images, provides remarkably detailed information on the pattern of movements of the main parties, identifies intentional targeting of civilians. The impact of conflict on civilians has been digitally documented. Forensic Architecture, a research team based at Goldsmiths University of London, in cooperation with Amnesty International, undertakes a similar digital reconstruction effort, such as the one of the notorious Sardinaya prison in Syria, bringing to life one of those blind spots, using testimonies from interviews with ex-detainees. As much as digital opportunities are transforming the way we work, the risks around digital vulnerability only become more acute. I think of the Afghans I met in Kandahar a few years ago who were very reluctant to share their biometrical data for registration purposes. Yes, digital transforms humanitarian action as I speak, basically. But we need to think about the principles of what I would like to call digital dignity, such as, for example, the signal code from the same Boston group I mentioned, which proposes a standard of obligations and minimum ethical and technical standards for humanitarian information activities. Let me now proceed to my third point before I end with my fourth point. And I just have a sip of water. My third point. In today's context of protracted conflicts, especially in urban contexts, I suggest a call for a more practical, and now you need to help me if you understand, ecumenism between development and aid. What I mean, Catholics and Protestants, they talk to each other, so they have ecumenism. That's what we say in German. I hope you understand what I mean. If not, you have to tell me afterwards. But I hope I make it clear now as I develop my third point. Over the past couple of years, I have become involved in the training of future Red Cross delegates. Training material is an interesting indicator actually of where a métier puts its strength and priorities and actually where not. 20 years ago, when I did my Red Cross basic training course, our case study was set in this imaginary Alpha Land. Alpha Land was built around successive wars of the Great Lakes in the 1990s. The training focused on needs of affected people in rural areas. Urban contexts were literally absent. With this training in mind, I started my career. In 1999, I did my apprenticeship, my humanitarian apprenticeship, as I mentioned, in Congo, actually in Lubumbashi, the second largest town of the DRC. I was also in charge of organizing food security assistance to several thousand urban IDPs. They squatted in empty warehouses, defunct factories, and I will never forget the site, this particular site, the airless cold store of an old slaughterhouse. It was a constant headache to inject large quantities of food every month without distorting local market realities. Each time an ICRC food bag was paraded on local TV after having been resold in the market, there was talk about diverted aid. The IDP simply sold their food bags to generate some income and buy something else. Food aid had become a currency. Instead of food handouts, the ICRC would have actually preferred cash assistance. Cash transfer assistance simply did not exist in our toolbox 20 years ago. Today, it happens almost everywhere, in every humanitarian crisis. Instead, we supported a government-led program that considered of first closing these urban IDP sites and then transferring IDPs 30 kilometers outside the city, where they were given land, tools and seeds to cultivate the land. That worked for those few who were experienced farmers. Most of them were not. They were people from urban centers in other cities. Surprisingly, urban contexts have, in my opinion, far too long remained terra incognita for many humanitarians. Today, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen push humanitarians into urban contexts. Besieging, sacking, destroying cities is actually nothing new for combatants, especially in today's asymmetric warfare, where groups stand little chance of surviving in large open battlefields and turn, of course, to urban contexts. In these densely populated areas, highly explosive weapons have a devastating effect on civilians, as you can see on those slides. Responding to the needs of affected populations in cities should be nothing novel if we look at where conflicts, historically, not even that long ago, 20 years, as you see it on that slide here, have been fought and often decided. It is in these complex environments where the traditional boundaries between development and aid, I think, have become obsolete. This is the main point I want to make here in this third part of my lecture. The interconnectivity of urban services makes cities particularly vulnerable. The large catchment areas of water purification systems or a regional hospital mean that the destruction of a single structure has cumulative impacts affecting thousands over long term, short term and long term. Couple the challenges of urban contexts with the challenges of seemingly never-ending protracted conflicts, and it becomes obvious that aid is not anymore only about immediate relief if it wants to respond to real needs. Aid is also about generating development holes to hold development in reverse, as we call it in the ICRC. It's somewhere there in the middle, okay? You see development holes, those guys in red. That's a bit the humanitarians these days, trying to keep development alive one way or the other, hoping that others would come. If not, you will see development development reversal. Okay, development holes to avoid development in reverse. I think that actually universities, with their schools of development studies and humanitarian emergency courses, have an important role to play in bringing a little bit of a sense of, again, this ecumenism between two professions that too often act like two separate religions. This perceived, often in fact taught schism between aid and development is not sustainable because the consequences of today's warfare, especially in urban contexts, don't really care about institutional semantics between schools of development and aid. Okay, so you have got development holds. You would actually then ideally have at one moment enhance the development holds in order to keep everything a little bit together. Okay, that's a bit the idea here. It's from an ICRC report. I do also do a little bit of PR for my organization. It's an interesting report. I can recommend it. In my remaining few minutes, I want to focus in my fourth point and last point on aspects of the age of reorder of the humanitarian configuration. Hugo Slim, my colleague at the ICRC, but of course also a most distinguished researcher on the humanitarian endeavor for many decades, would have called the Western humanitarian industrial enterprise, or this Western humanitarian industrial complex, of which I was part of in Darfur 13 years ago, a humanitarian expeditionary force. I think his term is quite spot on. Think of I think I have done something wrong. I forgot something, yes. Never mind. Think of Biafra in 1969. Think of Ethiopia in the 1980s. Great Lakes in the 90s. And I have forgotten, of course, the Thai-Cambodian border of the 1970s. Angola, Somalia, Afghanistan, the Balkans. The list is grossly incomplete. My point here is the composition of the Western humanitarian industrial enterprise is changing fast. Syria could probably become an interesting case study to illustrate this transformation, for example, in form of a new formula of complementarity between local and international operators. I think of the Red Cross and the Red Crescent movement response in particular. Sorry, there's something going wrong here. What have I done? Sorry, yes, This was the slide that I wanted to show you when I was talking about the past deployments of this big humanitarian enterprise. Now let me see whether I now manage it. Yes, okay. I believe this is the slide that shows Syria. Yes, it shows our head of delegation, Marianne Gasser, walking through across the front line in Aleppo in August 2015, together with Syrian Red Crescent volunteers. I believe it is here where historians' refresher from the past would be helpful for today's debates about the age of reorder in the humanitarian configuration. Think of the diverse community of aid providers during the Boer War in the early 20th century, where not only European private organizations deployed, but also Indian organizations. Now let me go back to my personal experience, and I hope the slides now come in the right sequence. Back in Darfur in 2005, I could probably be forgiven for being surprised by the arrival of the Turkish Red Crescent Society. I knew them, of course, as responders to massive earthquakes in the Bosporus region, but not as operators in armed conflicts like Darfur. Turkish doctors, nurses, and hospital administrators arrived by Turkish military planes one morning out of the blue. They built a level 2 field hospital in Yala with military precision. Meeting with the Turkish Red Crescent Society in Darfur 13 years ago was something new, not anymore. The Global Humanitarian Assistance Report 2018, the authoritative voice providing data about funding of humanitarian assistance as per Overseas Development Assistance, known as ODA, as defined by the Development Assistance Committee of the OECD, acknowledged this year that out of a total of $20.3 billion of aid provided in 2018, Turkey actually tops the list. As you can see here, I hope you can see it, providing just about $8 billion worth of aid. Yes, as most of these $8 billion go actually towards the assistance of Syrian refugees residing in Turkey, and therefore stricto sensu do not match the report's definition of humanitarian assistance, which is about spending aid outside of a donor country. The number one aid provider actually remains the US, with close to 6.7 billion, as you see it on this slide. Still, Turkey serves as an example of this age of reorder in the humanitarian landscape. China, of course, is another and deserves attention. In communist China, humanitarianism was seen as a tool of the hated bourgeoisie. Today, emergency rescue and emergency management, as humanitarian aid is referred to in China, is becoming a little bit more common. A recent ODI report on Chinese foreign policy and humanitarian action lists humanitarian values as the fourth of China's foreign policy priorities. The first two are linked to national interests. The third is about becoming a stakeholder in the international bodies as norm takers and norm modifier. And the fourth one, indeed, is about humanitarian values. Is based on solidarity with other developing countries and with those who are affected by disaster and conflict. Whether one disagrees now with China's normative basis to uphold the legitimacy of the state, sometimes very dubious states, whether one dislikes its focus on infrastructure building and not democracy building, finds China's absence from structures of international humanitarian system like the DAC, the OCHA donor support group, the good humanitarian donorship, and you name it. All these initiatives, a little bit irritating, that they stay out of these initiatives, a little bit irritating. Nevertheless, the sheer value of Chinese foreign aid, which amounts now to 7 billion, cannot be ignored. I hope you can see it. In 2013, it amounted to 7 billion. As much as it is necessary not to brush aside divergences in this age of reorder, it is also necessary in a more and more diverse humanitarian ecosystem to build on convergences. For example, the Chinese preference for tying humanitarian assistance to long-term development goals, their so-called Road and Belt initiative, should actually resonate not too badly with some of the Sustainable Development Goals or even the United Nations' new way of working, which advocates a similar end goal, the goal to end poverty. Let me conclude. It is always an uphill battle to address a well-informed audience. Many points that I have made tonight are not new for you. Maybe hardly anything has been. I've been talking about smoker and non-smoker conversations in smoking compartments. I've been talking about a digital humanitarian action, about digital vulnerabilities and digital dignity, not only about digital opportunities. I've talked about this whole idea about bringing aid and development a little bit closer one way or the other. And then indeed I talked about this age of reorder in the field of humanitarian action, yes. Still, I hope that I have at least reminded you of things that might have slipped your minds. Connected dots where you thought there were no connections to be made. Hopefully, I have given some ideas to the historians of humanitarian action in this room as to where to invest in another PhD or maybe even a research project. Of course, talking about change and transformation always begs the question, what should not change? I think for me, two things are important. In whatever direction humanitarian action goes, all those who claim to do the humanitarian stuff should never forget that the principles of humanity and impartiality are the floor through which humanitarians should not fall. And although it might look a little bit odd to add a lecture on humanitarian action in our age of reorder, where the present is never present, but it is already past, it's all about change. It might be a little bit odd to end such a talk with a picture of a gentleman from Switzerland, or a few pictures actually, taken back in the 1930s and 1940s. It is precisely what Dr. Marcel Junot, an iconic ICRC delegate who worked in the Abyssinia War of 1935, the Spanish Civil War in occupied Nazi Germany, and actually visited Hiroshima in 1945, a few days after the 6th of August, calls that spirit of the thing that should drive us humanitarians at all times. And I usually don't like to show slides with quotes, but this one I think is a good one. It was that spirit, the spirit of combat, which we kept alive in us and which so often persuaded us to attempt the impossible, to extend the limits imposed on our action against the efforts of those who just as constantly tried to restrict them still further. I know I could not say it better than my former ICRC colleague Marcel Junot did more than 80 years ago. Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you for your attention.